The Malleus Maleficarum. Part 2, Question I. Chapter 3. How they are transported from place to place. And now we must consider their ceremonies and in what manner they proceed in their operations, first in respect of their actions towards themselves and in their own persons. And among their chief operations are being bodily transported from place to place, and to practice carnal connection with incubus devils, which we shall treat of separately, beginning with their bodily victification. But here it must be noted that this transaction offers a difficulty, which has often been mentioned, arising from one single authority, where it is said, it cannot be admitted as true that certain wicked women, perverted by Satan and seduced by the illusions and phantasms of devils, do actually, as they believe and profess, ride in the night time on certain beasts with Diana, a goddess of the pagans, or with Herodias and an innumerable multitude of women, and in the untimely silence of night pass over immense tracts of land, and have to obey her in all things as their mistress, etc. Wherefore the priest of God ought to preach to the people that this is altogether false, and that such phantasms are sent not by God, but by an evil spirit to confuse the minds of the faithful. For Satan himself transforms himself into various shapes and forms, and by deluding in dreams the mind which he holds captive, leads it through devious ways, etc. And there are those who, taking their example from S. Germain and a certain other man who kept watch over his daughter to determine this matter, sometimes preach that this is an altogether impossible thing, and that it is indiscreet to ascribe to witches and their operations such levitations, as well as the injuries which happen to men, animals, and the fruits of the earth, since just as they are the victims of fantasy in their transaction, so also are they deluded in the matter of the harm they wreak on living creatures. But this opinion was refuted as heretical in the first question, for it leaves out of account the divine permission with regard to the devil's power, which extends to even greater things than this, and it is contrary to the meaning of sacred scripture, and has caused intolerable damage to Holy Church, since now for many years, thanks to this pestiferous doctrine, witches have remained unpunished, because the secular courts have lost their power to punish them. Therefore the diligent reader will consider what was there set down for the stamping out of that opinion, and will for the present note how they are transported, and in what ways this is possible, of which some examples will be adduced. It is shown in various ways that they can be bodily transported, and first, from the operations of other magicians. For if they could not be transported, it would either be because God does not permit it, or because the devil cannot do this since it is contrary to nature. It cannot be for the first reason, for both greater and less things can be done by the permission of God, and greater things are often done both to children and men, even to just men confirmed in grace. For when it is asked whether substitutions of children can be effected by the work of devils, and whether the devil can carry a man from place to place even against his will, to the first question the answer is, yes. For William of Paris says in the last part of his De Unio Urso, substitutions of children are, with God's permission, possible, so that the devil can effect a change of the child or even a transformation. For such children are always miserable and crying, and although 4 or 5 mothers could hardly support enough milk for them, they never grow fat, yet are heavy beyond the ordinary. But this should neither be affirmed nor denied to women, on account of the great fear which it may cause them, but they should be instructed to ask the opinion of learned men. For God permits this on account of the sins of the parents, in that sometimes men curse their pregnant wives, saying, "May you be carrying a devil," or some such thing. In the same way impatient women often say something of the sort. And many examples have been given by other men, some of them pious men. For Vincent of Beauvais, Spec. History, XXVI, 43, related a story told by S. Peter Damian of a 5-year-old son of a nobleman, who was for the time living in a monastery, and one night he was carried out of the monastery into a locked mill, where he was found in the morning. And when he was questioned, he said that he had been carried by some men to a great feast and bidden to eat, and afterwards he was put into the mill through the roof. And what of those magicians whom we generally call necromancers, who are often carried through the air by devils for long distances? And sometimes they even persuade others to go with them on a horse, which is not really a horse but a devil in that form, and, as they say, thus warn their companions not to make the sign of the cross. And though we are two who write this book, one of us has very often seen and known such men. For there is a man who was once a scholar, and is now believed to be a priest in the diocese of Freising, who used to say that at one time he had been bodily carried through the air by a devil, and taken to the most remote parts. There lives another priest in Oberdorf, a town near Landshut, who was at that time a friend of that one of us, who saw with his own eyes such a transportation, and tells how the man was borne on high with arms stretched out, shouting but not whimpering. And the cause, as he tells it, was as follows. A number of scholars had met together to drink beer, and they all agreed that the one who fetched the beer should not have to pay anything. And so one of them was going to fetch the beer, and on opening the door saw a thick cloud before the grunsel, and returning in terror told his companions why he would not go for the drink. Then that one of them who was carried away said angrily, "Even if the devil were there, I shall fetch the drink." And, going out, he was carried through the air in the sight of all the others. And indeed it must be confessed that such things can happen not only to those who are awake, but also to men who are asleep, namely, they can be bodily transported through the air while they are fast asleep. This is clear in the case of certain men who walk in their sleep on the roofs of houses and over the highest buildings, and no one can oppose their progress either on high or below. And if they are called by their own names by the other bystanders, they immediately fall crashing to the ground. Many think, and not without reason, that this is devil's work. For devils are of many different kinds, and some, who fell from the lower choir of angels, are tortured as if for smaller sins with lighter punishments as well as the punishment of damnation which they must suffer eternally. And these cannot hurt anybody, at least not seriously, but for the most part carry out only practical jokes. And others are incubi or succubi, who punish men in the night, defiling them in the sin of lechery. It is not wonderful if they are given also to horseplay such as this. The truth can be deduced from the words of Cassian, Colations I, where he says that there is no doubt that there are as many different unclean spirits as there are different desires in men. For it is manifest that some of them, which the common people call fauns, and we call trolls, which abound in Norway, are such buffoons and jokers that they haunt certain places and roads and, without being able to do any hurt to those who pass by, are content with mocking and deluding them, and try to weary them rather than hurt them. And some of them only visit men with harmless nightmares. But others are so furious and truculent that they are not content to afflict with an atrocious dilation the bodies of those whom they inflate, but even come rushing from on high and hasten to strike them with the most savage blows. Our author means that they do not only possess men, but torture them horribly, as did those which are described in S. Matthew 8. From this we can conclude, first that it must not be said that witches cannot be locally transported because God does not permit it. For if he permits it in the case of the just and innocent, and of other magicians, how should he not in the case of those who are totally dedicated to the devil? And we say with all reverence, Did not the devil take up our Savior, and carry him up to a high place, as the Gospel testifies? Neither can the second argument of our opponents be conceded, that the devil cannot do this thing. For it has already been shown that he has so great natural power, exceeding all corporeal power, that there is no earthly power that can be compared with him, as it is said, there is no power on earth that can be compared with him, etc. Indeed, the natural power or virtue which is in Lucifer is so great that there is none greater among the good angels in heaven. For just as he excelled all the angels in his nature, and not his nature, but only his grace, was diminished by his fall, so that nature still remains in him, although it is darkened and bound. Wherefore the gloss on that there is no power on earth says, although he excels all things, yet he is subject to the merits of the saints. Two objections which someone may bring forward are not valid. First, that man's soul could resist him, and that the text seems to speak of one devil in particular, since it speaks in the singular, namely Lucifer. And because it was he who tempted Christ in the wilderness, and seduced the first man, he is now bound in chains. And the other angels are not so powerful, since he excels them all. Therefore the other spirits cannot transport wicked men through the air from place to place. These arguments have no force. For, to consider the angels first, even the least angel is incomparably superior to all human power, as can be proved in many ways. First, a spiritual is stronger than a corporeal power, and so is the power of an angel, or even of the soul, greater than that of the body. Secondly, as to the soul, every bodily shape owes its individuality to matter, and, in the case of human beings, to the fact that a soul informs it, but immaterial forms are absolute intelligences, and therefore have an absolute and more universal power. For this reason, the soul when joined to the body cannot in this way suddenly transfer its body locally or raise it up in the air, although it could easily do so, with God's permission, if it were separate from its body. Much more, then, is this possible to an entirely immaterial spirit, such as a good or bad angel. For a good angel transported Habakkuk in a moment from Judea to Chaldea. And for this reason it is concluded that those who by night are carried in their sleep over high buildings are not carried by their own souls, nor by the influence of the stars, but by some mightier power, as was shown above. Thirdly, it is the nature of the body to be moved, as to place, directly by a spiritual nature, and, as Aristotle says, Physics, 8, local motion is the first of bodily motions, and he proves this by saying that local motion is not intrinsically in the power of any body as such, but is due to some exterior force. Wherefore it is concluded, not so much from the holy doctors as from the philosophers, that the highest bodies, that is, the stars, are moved by spiritual essences, and by separate intelligences which are good both by nature and in intention. For we see that the soul is the prime and chief cause of local motion in the body. It must be said, therefore, that neither in its physical capacity nor in that of its soul can the human body resist being suddenly transported from place to place, with God's permission, by a spiritual essence good both in intention and by nature, when the good, who are confirmed in grace, are transported, or by an essence good by nature, but not good in intention, when the wicked are transported. Any who wish may refer to S. Thomas in 3 articles in Part I, question 90, and again in his question concerning sin, and also in the second book of Sentences, Dist. 7, on the power of devils over bodily effects. Now the following is their method of being transported. They take the unguent which, as we have said, they make it the devil's instruction from the limbs of children, particularly of those whom they have killed before baptism, and anoint with it a chair or a broomstick, whereupon they are immediately carried up into the air, either by day or by night. And either visibly or, if they wish, invisibly, for the devil can conceal a body by the interposition of some other substance, as was shown in the first part of the treatise where we spoke of the glamours and illusions caused by the devil. And although the devil for the most part performs this by means of this unguent, to the end that children should be deprived of the grace of baptism and of salvation, yet he often seems to effect the same transaction without its use. For at times he transports the witches on animals, which are not true animals but devils in that form, and sometimes even without any exterior help they are visibly carried solely by the operation of the devil's power. Here is an instance of a visible transportation in the daytime. In the town of Waldshut on the Rhine, in the diocese of Constance, there was a certain witch who was so detested by the townsfolk that she was not invited to the celebration of a wedding which, however, nearly all the other townsfolk were present. Being indignant because of this, and wishing to be revenged, she summoned a devil and, telling him the cause of her vexation, asked him to raise a hailstorm and drive all the wedding guests from their dancing, and the devil agreed, and raising her up, carried her through the air to a hill near the town, in the sight of some shepherds. And since, as she afterwards confessed, she had no water to pour into the trench, for this, as we shall show, is the method they use to raise hailstorms, she made a small trench and filled it with her urine instead of water, and stirred it with her finger, after their custom, with the devil standing by. Then the devil suddenly raised that liquid up and sent a violent storm of hailstones which fell only on the dancers and townsfolk. And when they had dispersed and were discussing among themselves the cause of that storm, the witch shortly afterwards entered the town, and this greatly aroused their suspicions. But when the shepherds had told what they had seen, their suspicions became almost a certainty. So she was arrested, and confessed that she had done this thing because she had not been invited to the wedding, and for this, and for many other witchcrafts which she had perpetrated, she was burned. And since the public report of this sort of transaction is continually being spread even among the common people, it is unnecessary to add further proof of it here. But we hope that this will suffice to refute those who either deny altogether that there are such transactions, or try to maintain that they are only imaginary or fantastical. And, indeed, it would be a matter of small importance if such men were left in their error, were it not that this error tends to the damage of the faith. For notice that, not content with that error, they do not fear to maintain and publish others also, to the increase of witches and the detriment of the faith. For they assert that all the witchcraft which is truly and actually ascribed to witches as instruments of the devil is only so ascribed in imagination and illusion, as if they were really harmless, just as their transaction is only fantastic. And for this reason many witches remain unpunished, to the great displeasure of the Creator, and to their own most heavy increase. The arguments on which they base their fallacy cannot be conceded. For first they advance the chapter of the Canon, Episcopi, 26, q. 5, where it is said that witches are only transported in imagination, but who is so foolish as to conclude from this that they cannot also be bodily transported? Similarly at the end of that chapter it is set down that whoever believes that a man can be changed for the better or the worse, or can be transformed into another shape, is to be thought worse than an infidel or a pagan, but who could conclude from this that men cannot be transformed into beasts by a glamour, or that they cannot be changed from health to sickness and from better to worse? They who so scratch at the surface of the words of the canon hold an opinion which is contrary to that of all the holy doctors, and, indeed, against the teaching of the Holy Scripture. For the contrary opinion is abundantly proved by what has been written in various places in the first part of this treatise, and it is necessary to study the inner meaning of the words of the canon. And this was examined in the first question of the first part of the treatise, in refuting the second of three errors which are there condemned, and where it is said that four things are to be preached to the people. For they are transported both bodily and fantastically, as is proved by their own confessions, not only of those who have been burned, but also of others who have returned to penitence and the faith. Among such there was the woman in the town of Brasach, whom we asked whether they could be transported only in imagination, or actually in the body, and she answered that it was possible in both ways. For if they do not wish to be bodily transferred, but want to know all that is being done in a meeting of their companions, then they observe the following procedure. In the name of all the devils they lie down to sleep on their left side, and then a sort of bluish vapor comes from their mouth, through which they can clearly see what is happening. But if they wish to be bodily transported, they must observe the method which has been told. Besides, even if that canon be understood in its bare meaning without any explanation, who is so dense as to maintain on that account that all their witchcraft and injuries are fantastic and imaginary, when the contrary is evident to the senses of everybody? Especially since there are many species of superstition, namely, 14, among which the species of witches holds the highest degree in spells and injuries, and the species of Pythoness, to which they can be reduced, which is only able to be transported in imagination, holds the lowest degree. And we do not concede that their error can be substantiated by the legends of S. Germain and certain others. For it was possible for the devils to lie down themselves by the side of the sleeping husbands, during the time when a watch was being kept on the wives, just as if they were sleeping with their husbands. And we do not say that this was done for any reverence felt for the saint, but the case is put that the opposite of what is set down in the legend may not be believed to be impossible. In the same way all other objections can be answered, that it is found that some witches are transported only in imagination, but that it is also found in the writings of the doctors that many have been bodily transported. Whoever wishes may refer to Thomas of Brabant in his book about bees, and he will find many wonderful things concerning both the imaginary and the bodily transaction of men.